By the morning of 6th of November 1895, in a small anteroom off the chancel of St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, New York, the marriage market had done its work. Consuelo Vanderbilt, 21, sat in her wedding gown while, as she later recalled, a footman stood guard outside her door so she could not escape. I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone. No one came near me, she wrote years later, describing how even her governess was barred. Beyond the door, the nave bloomed with banks of white flowers. The press called it the wedding of the century, and the Duke of Marlborough's debts were about to be exchanged for Vanderbilt Railroad stock and annual payments. On Consuelo's lap lay a pair of ivory kid gloves. Photographs from the period show similar brides with hands perfectly arranged, fingers aligned in a grammar of obedience. In that quiet room, the ritual gesture of smoothing a glove no longer looked like elegance. It looked like consent being fastened in place. The doors would open soon. The cost was already paid. On the night of 26th of March, 1883, at 665th Avenue, Alva Vanderbilt opened the doors of her new French chateau with a costume ball for some 1,000 guests. Contemporary reports estimated the cost at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The New York World speculated it exceeded $250,000, a deliberate display aimed at forcing old New York, led by Carolyn Astor, to accept the Vanderbilt fortune. The surviving invitation cards, photographs of Alice Vanderbilt's famous electric light dress by Worth, and society columns preserved at the Museum of the City of New York show how meticulously every detail was planned: costumes, tableau, even the order of arrivals. Somewhere in the crush of silk and electric globes, 6-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt appeared briefly, the ball technically in her honor. Her mother had engineered not just a party, but an official entry into the only social ledger that mattered. Outside, carriage wheels scraped against the curb. Inside, calling cards and guest lists turned a child's future into strategy. The Vanderbilt ball was not simply spectacle. It was a mother's calculated entry ticket into the narrow circle that controlled which daughters might one day be offered to dukes. Before Consuelo met a duke, her mother had already rehearsed how to move her across a chessboard. By 1890, in drawing rooms from New York to Newport, the marriage market could be held in one's hands. That year's edition of Titled Americans, a real quarterly guide, listed eligible titled bachelors, their ages, incomes, and prospects, alongside American women who had already married into European nobility. Chauncey Depew, railroad lawyer and public orator, explained bluntly why English noblemen courted American brides. They needed money. In excerpts reprinted with the guide, he noted that these unions were driven by fortune on one side and position on the other, giving mothers a vocabulary of investment rather than romance. On mahogany tables beside crystal inkwells and engraved stationery, copies of Titled Americans lay open like ledgers. The rustle of silk skirts accompanied the turning of pages. Gloves were adjusted before ink touched paper to write for introductions. No diary tells us exactly which mother circled which name, but the existence of these publications and their circulation in elite circles leave little doubt that the search for a titled son-in-law was often conducted with the precision of business. Printed lists turned men into rows of data and daughters into potential entries on the successfully married page. The language was social, but the logic was financial. In the spring of 1890, in Washington, D.C., Mary Victoria Leader, daughter of Chicago department store magnate Levi Leader, stood at an upstairs window of the family's Lafayette Square house, watching carriages arrive for another diplomatic dinner. Biographical accounts describe the Leader's Washington home as a salon for senators, diplomats, and visiting British officials. Mary's London debut had been discussed for years. By 1890, she was being quietly prepared for it. Her letters, later quoted by biographers, show a young woman both observant and ambitious, writing careful notes of thanks to visiting dignitaries and describing her efforts to perfect her French and her curtsy. The rustle of her gown as she turned from the window, the smooth movement of gloved hands over cream-colored notepaper, belonged as much to political grooming as to feminine accomplishment. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 100 American women would marry into the British aristocracy. Anne de Courcy counted about 60 unions with elder sons and at least 6 with dukes. Their fathers supplied fortunes from railroads, steel, and department stores. Their mothers supplied tireless social navigation. It was called romance in the press. In private letters and financial settlements, it read more like diplomacy. From Lafayette Square to London's drawing rooms, Mary's education in conversation and correspondence was already a rehearsal for her future role as Vicereine of India. On an autumn morning in the 1880s, at Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, a bell called young women to class. Founded in 1843 by Sarah Porter, the school's 19th century curriculum combined sciences, chemistry, physiology, astronomy, with languages, music, and deportment, unusual rigor for a girls' school of the period. School records and later histories describe days structured by timetables, French recitations, piano practice, walks conducted at a proper pace, and always letter writing under supervision. Girls sat at long tables, ink blots carefully avoided, thanking host families, responding to invitations, perfecting the formal phrases that would sustain them through future London and Paris seasons. The correction of posture, shoulders back, chin level, accompanied corrections of grammar. Though not all Miss Porter's alumni became dollar princesses, this blend of intellectual seriousness and social polish formed a model many elite families sought to reproduce with private governesses and finishing schools. Education here was both broadening and narrowing. It extended women's knowledge while training their bodies and pens to move along very specific lines. By the early 1890s, many wealthy American families sent their daughters to European finishing schools or to extended stays in Paris and London, where language tutors, dance masters, and dressmakers completed what American schools began. The Leiter sisters, for example, spent time in England, acquiring the ease and accent expected of future transatlantic brides. Dressmakers like Charles Frederick Worth in Paris provided not only couture gowns, but an education in how to wear them. Worth's electric light gown for Alice Vanderbilt, created for Alva's 1883 ball, survives as an object lesson in how fabric, embroidery, and technology could advertise a family's modernity and wealth. Young women stood on mirrored platforms as fitters adjusted bodices. The persistent smoothing of gloves before stepping out of a fitting room became part of the choreography of public appearance. European finishing did not merely refine taste. It translated money into a visual dialect that British aristocrats understood immediately. In the early 1890s, at Marble House in Newport and the Vanderbilt Mansions on Fifth Avenue, Consuelo Vanderbilt's education was intensified. Memoirs and later histories describe her mother Alva's relentless focus on languages, music, deportment, and above all, obedience. When the ninth Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, appeared as a prospective suitor, Alva's efforts took on a sharper edge. By September 1895, the couple were engaged. Alva leaked details of the match and even the gold fastenings of Consuelo's undergarments to the press, turning her daughter's body into public property. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo recalled being locked in her room and pressured until she agreed. On her wedding day, she wrote, "I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone. A footman had been posted at the door of my apartment. The same hand that had been trained to write flawless notes of thanks now signed consent under duress." Consuelo's refinement, her languages, her poise, her famous grace, became the very tools that allowed her mother to present her as a flawless offering to a nearly bankrupt duke. In 1890, Mary Leader was formally introduced to London society, the culmination of years of preparation in Washington and abroad. Biographers note that she met George Nathaniel Curzon, a conservative MP and expert on Asian politics, during this period. She admired his intellect as much as his title. Letters later collected suggest a young woman attentive to detail, noting seating arrangements, rehearsing the nuances of conversation, and writing copious thank-you notes, the clink of glassware at London dinners, The smell of gaslight and beeswax in drawing rooms, the feel of a fan opening and closing in a gloved hand, all belong to a social environment in which charm and tact could be as decisive as a dowry. Where some marriages were almost pure financial transactions, Mary's case illustrates a more complex equation. Money, yes, but also shared ambition and the persuasive power of a well-trained conversationalist. By the early 1890s, the phenomenon had become visible enough for journalists to give it a name. Articles on dollar princesses and husband hunters appeared in newspapers and magazines, noting that around 100 American heiresses married British aristocrats between 1870 and 1914, and de Courcy's research, building on period sources, shows that it was often the mothers who drove these campaigns, arranging introductions through embassy dinners, renting houses in Mayfair for the London season, and studying guides like Titled Americans for the latest list of eligible peers. In this world, writing a gracious note after a ball was not simply good manners. It was step 12 in a carefully plotted sequence of appearances, calls, and invitations designed to keep a daughter in the right rooms at the right hours. The artistry of social grace concealed an infrastructure of strategy. Visiting cards, seating charts, train timetables, managed largely by women whose own choices had been similarly constrained. On 12th of August 1873, at a regatta on the Isle of Wight, American heiress Jenny Jerome met Lord Randolph Churchill, third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, at a reception hosted by the Prince of Wales. They became engaged within days. His parents were initially horrified. She was American, her father a speculative financier, her manners too free for their taste. As later recounted in histories of the family, attitudes changed when financial settlements were discussed. A dowry of $250,000, several million in today's terms, helped secure agreement. On 15th April 1874, at the British Embassy in Paris, Jenny married Randolph. The sound of church bells and carriage wheels outside masked the rustle of legal documents inside. Settlements that pinned American dollars to an aristocratic but financially strained family. Jenny would go on to live a dazzling, controversial life. Her son Winston later writing, "She shone for me, like the evening star, at a distance." Long before Consuelo or Mary, Jenny's marriage demonstrated how a single American fortune could shift the prospects of a British political dynasty. On 22nd April 1895, at St. John's Episcopal Church on Lafayette Square, Washington, D.C., Mary later married George Curzon. Contemporary accounts describe an elaborate society wedding attended by diplomats and political figures, marking the union of Chicago retail wealth and an ancient Derbyshire estate, Kettleston Hall. Curzon's biographers acknowledge that he married Mary in part to stabilize his finances and preserve Kettleston. Her father's fortune underwrote the restoration of the house and the couple's role within the British elite. After the ceremony, the signing of the parish register, the exchange of rings, and the glide of satin down the church steps were accompanied by the invisible transfer of capital across the Atlantic. Mary's subsequent letters as Viceroy of India show that she embraced her role with intelligence and a sense of responsibility. But the basic arithmetic remained. Without her fortune, Curzon's career and estate would have looked very different. In Mary's case, marriage functioned as both personal partnership and macroeconomic intervention in the survival of an aristocratic house. On 6 November 1895, St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, New York, became a botanical fairyland, as one newspaper put it, for the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt to Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. The New York and British press reported every detail: the Worth wedding gown, the jewels, the Vanderbilt guests, the presence of police to control crowds outside. The dowry reportedly included millions in railroad stock and significant annual payments to sustain Blenheim Palace. Inside, the organ music, heavy scent of flowers, and rustle of satin masked a more private reality. Consuelo, in her own words, had cried so much that the ceremony was delayed. Her mother's pressure had overridden her wishes. In the formal photographs, the bride's gloved hands rest perfectly, the angle of the wrist studied and serene. In her memoir, The same hands remember turning a locked doorknob. Here, the marriage market reached its most visible climax. Thousands watched a transaction that exchanged American money for one of Britain's highest titles, while the bride's private consent remained ambiguous at best. By 1900, the first generation of dollar princesses was inhabiting its roles. In India, Lady Curzon became vicereine, her peacock dress, embroidered with real beetle wings for the 1903 Delhi Durbar, now preserved at Kettleston Hall. In London, Consuelo Marlborough emerged as a drawing-room diplomat, using her position to support philanthropic causes and social reform. Letters and memoirs from these years show women navigating constrained power, hosting political dinners, chairing charitable committees, negotiating with husbands and relatives over money and access. The same handwriting that once composed thank you notes to hostesses now drafted appeals for hospitals and schools. Within the architecture of marriages arranged for money and status, some women use their cultivated grace as a form of soft power, redirecting a portion of the wealth that had bought their titles. By the time Mary Curzon died in July 1906 in London, exhausted by years of ill health, and Jenny Churchill died in 1921, the world that had produced their marriages was already changing. After Consuelo's separation from the Duke, in 1906 and eventual annulment, she remarried and pursued an independent life, later serving in local government and suffrage causes. World wars, income taxes, and the decline of great estates reshaped the British aristocracy. Yet the physical traces remain. Visitors to Kettleston Hall can still see the chapel Curzon added as a memorial to Mary. The peacock dress is under conservation. Sargent's portraits of dollar princesses are displayed in galleries, their sitters' gloved hands still impeccably at rest. In archives, boxes of letters and diaries preserve the micro-rituals, the endless thank you notes, the careful engagements, the occasional stray line of protest. Turning those pages now, we see how often the ink traces the same looping gestures, even as individual lives diverged. The ballrooms are quieter, but the documentary record is full. What remains is not just the story of fortunes exchanged for coronets, but of women who lived inside that bargain, sometimes reinforcing it, sometimes bending it, and sometimes finding ways to step outside it. In a glass case in a museum, a pair of ivory kid gloves lies beside a calling card and a dog-eared copy of Titled Americans. No plaque can fully explain them. The viewer is left to imagine the hand that once slipped into those gloves, picked up that pen, and signed a name that would travel farther than she ever intended.